In 1967, London was the place to be. It was swinging like a pendulum do. And now I know you're looking, oh, Bernie's wearing a Beatles shirt. Here's another episode about the Beatles. Well, kind of, but only peripherally. Because you see, in 1967, Brian Epstein had this idea that they needed a tax shelter. So they needed to create their own company. And the company became Apple Corps. And Apple Corps had a number of divisions, which was Apple Retail. Now, that was pretty short-lived. Apple Electronics, not much came out of that. Apple Publishing, okay. Apple Films, okay. And then there was Apple Records. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. Apple Records has published 137 singles and 80 albums. Interestingly, the first and the last album to be released on Apple Records were both by George Harrison, who was the Quiet Beatle. The first was Wonderwall Music, and the last was Let It Roll, songs by George Harrison. Of these 80 albums that Apple Records has released, it's fitting that 51 of them were the Beatles or members of the Beatles after they broke up. But that still means that there were 29 albums that Apple released which are not the Beatles. Some of them are good, some of them are forgettable. Let's take a look at some of them. But there's one I'm sure that you've probably never heard of. You ready? Let's drop the needle. The year is 1967, and Brian Epstein has just died. And frankly, the Beatles are a bit adrift. Now, Brian had come up with this idea that they needed to form a company, basically as a tax dodge, and that was going to be Apple Corps. Naturally, the plan was for Apple Records to publish Beatle records, and they did. But also, they encouraged the four Beatles to sign up artists that they really liked. And in most cases, when those artists recorded their Apple records, that particular Beatle would not only appear on the record, but would often produce it. So let's take a look at some of the different artists who signed with Apple Records. And we'll also look at the first act to sign, who unfortunately never had their album published by Apple Records. The very first Apple record, product number Apple I, is very rare, and I don't have it. It is a recording by Frank Sinatra singing Maureen is the Champ, based on The Lady is a Tramp, that Ringo had Frank record as a birthday present for his wife Maureen. The first non-Beatle album to be released on Apple is one of the most famous, James Taylor, the American folk artist, and it was produced by Paul McCartney's friend Peter Asher of Peter and Gordon. Another big star, soon to be, was Apple's seventh release, which is Postcard by Mary Hopkin, and it was produced by Paul McCartney. This was followed quickly by an album by Jackie Lomax, a friend of the Beatles from the Liverpool days. George Harrison produced it, and in fact, he gave Jackie Lomax a song that he had debuted for the Beatles and they rejected. It was called Sour Milk Sea. George produced another album with his friend Billy Preston. That's the way God planned it. And in fact, Billy Preston is the only artist to be credited playing on Beatles songs. He's credited on the songs around Let It Be, he's on The Rooftop, he's on the film, and of course he'll be in the new film that Peter Jackson is making about that time. Another group who got signed by Apple who went on to fame were originally called the Ivies, but then they morphed into Badfinger. And as Badfinger, they released a number of hit albums on Apple. But Apple Records was not all mainstream. George produced and recorded the Radha Krishna Temple, and John recorded David Peel and the Lower East Side with their song, The Pope Smokes Dope. But Apple did salvage themselves by releasing the long out of print and great Phil Spector's Christmas album. The Apple logo design is also a very interesting story. It started out being a bright green Granny Smith apple, and side A was the apple and side B was a cross-section of the apple cut in half. But like anything that the Beatles got involved with, nothing stayed static. Everything moved, and the Apple logo morphed as well. In the US, the Let It Be album has a red apple, and this is for legal reasons, because this was a soundtrack, and so they were obligated to release this as part of their deal with United Artists. George Harrison, for his great first album, All Things Must Pass, decided that the Apple logo should be orange. And the third record in that set, which was a jam, featured an apple jar jam. John used a white apple for his Plastic Ono Band album. But George, not only releasing the last album on Apple, but early on, had a bit of fun at the group's expense. His album Extra Texture, Read All About It, the Apple logo is bitten down to its core. This is as the time the Beatles were disintegrating. As I've mentioned before in a previous episode, there was a subsidiary label called Zapple, and this was to be the Beatles' avant-garde label where they could put out spoken word, they could do whatever they wanted. Really, it only had 2 albums, Electronic Sounds by George Harrison and Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions by John and Yoko. And now for the band, who was the first band to be signed by Apple Records, and probably a band you've never heard of. They were from Liverpool, and they were signed before Brian Epstein died. And it's a rather interesting story. They were in London, and they saw Paul McCartney walking his sheepdog Martha around Hyde Park. So they went up to Paul and they pleaded with Paul that they needed a record deal. And Paul said, "Come by the office tomorrow." And so they did. And on Tomorrow, John Lennon signed them as the first act for Apple Records. I discovered this band actually on Amazon. I was looking for books to read, and this one popped up. It's called All You Need Is Luck, or How We Got a Record Deal by Meeting Paul McCartney by Paul Tennant, and the name of the group is Focal Point. I strongly recommend this book. It is a great read. And in fact, after reading the book, Amazon recommended that I check out this CD by the group Focal Point. It's called First Bite of the Apple, and it is all the recordings that they did. Now, interestingly enough, this was a book that led me to music that I'd never heard of. You need to check this out too. There are great songs on here. After Brian Epstein died, Focal Point became managed by the Beatles' roadie, Mal Evans. And they recorded a number of their songs in the unfinished Beatles studio on Baker Street, and in fact, using Beatles instruments. For some reason, Focal Point's single and subsequent album never came out on Apple Records. It came out on Deerham, and their single, Sycamore Sid, actually lists Apple Publishing as part of the credit. The single didn't sell, and the group broke up in 1969. Apple Records had an amazing run, and they released a number of great other albums, including the likes of the Modern Jazz Quartet, Doris Troy, Delaney and Bonnie, and even Elephant's Memory. The Beatles, and by extension, Apple Records, have become a worldwide phenomenon. And I gotta tell you, I never expected when I visited the Galapagos that I would see this t-shirt as a takeoff on Abbey Road. Apple Records shows you not only the talent of the Beatles, but also of the artists that they liked. Oh, by the way, this is kind of cool and it's kind of rare. It's this little green apple. It says the Beatles on it, and when you pull open the top, there's a USB stick. And in very high resolution, all of the Beatles albums are on this little apple. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. As I always say, keep it rocking. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out. Most of the albums that I talk about can be found at your local vinyl store or on eBay. Individual songs most likely are on Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon Music, or even some on YouTube.